Hey guys, this is John, and in this video I'm going to teach you how to properly play and evaluate one of the most common types of endgames in chess, which is what we have here, king and pawn versus king. So many chess games reduce down to king and pawn versus king. It's considered to be the backbone of all endgame knowledge, so it's important that you understand everything there is to know about this type of endgame, because it's actually not that difficult, as we'll see by applying some rules. So often when this endgame is reached, we'll see players who are not so familiar with the theory of this endgame to play the position something like this. And for our purposes, you're looking at white's side, by the way. White's pawn is going this way, so it's queening on d8. It's a long ways away from queening right now. So say we're white to move here. You'll see someone play d3, king d4, king d2, black will retreat, king d5, white's king will come up, black may come here, king c5, white could give a check, king d5, king d3, king back to d6. Let's say white goes to this side, king e6, pawn d5 check, king d6. You're probably starting to notice a pattern emerge. King d4, king back to d7, king c5, king c7, d6 check, king here, king d5, king d8, king c6, king c8. Now, right about here is when most players playing white, who are not aware of what's going on in this ending, start to pause and think. Because they realize that if they play d7 check, as they've been doing this entire time, marching the pawn up slowly, black will play king d8, and white's remaining choices are not good here. They either have to play king d6, which is the consistent move, whereupon it is stalemate. Black has no legal moves to make with their king. All these squares are covered by the white king and pawn. Or if not king d6, white will have to play their king away somewhere, let's say king b7, whereupon black will take the pawn on d7. I've seen this play out hundreds of times in games that I've seen online between low-rated players, games of students that have first come to me that don't know this type of ending. It's just so common. So backing up to that initial position, so we started with this position. What's powerful about knowing this ending is that you can evaluate any king and pawn versus king position. And in that little mini game that I just played out for you guys, if white plays d3, the position is already drawn. We can definitively say this is equal after pawn d3. Black should not lose so long as they play correctly. The best move for white instead was king to d3. And this is what a lot of people don't understand straight away about king and pawn versus king. They think that by advancing the pawn and having their king behind the pawn, they're making progress. Because, as we were showing, eventually black's king does have to retreat, and white's pawn is inching up the board. I mean, what could go wrong? We have to promote our pawn if we're going to win. We have to try to make a queen and checkmate black, so everything is all good, right? Wrong. The issue is that you're advancing the pawn in this way without the king clearing squares for the pawn to advance. And in order to win this ending, the side with the extra pawn has to use their king aggressively, and they have to clear as much territory in front of the pawn, and only then advance the pawn when it's safe to do so. If you have this type of position with the king behind the pawn and the defending king optimally placed immediately in front of the pawn, it will always be drawn. So going back here, I mentioned that king d3 is the correct move. And this takes us to the concept of the opposition. So the opposition. And the opposition is something you may have heard of, but don't completely understand it. It's a little daunting at first because there are many definitions of what the opposition is, but I'm going to try to give you a very clear one. So the opposition is simply a way to determine whether king and pawn versus king ending is a win for the side with the pawn, or whether it's drawn. So it's just a way to determine that. And the opposition is brought about when you have three criteria. So those criteria are kings on the same color square along a file. So as we see here, kings on the D file, both on the same color square, light squares. An odd number of squares in between the kings. So this is the most common type of opposition where you have one square in between. One is an odd number, so we've got that criteria fulfilled. And it's the opponent's turn to move, is the third criteria. So after white plays king to d3, it will be black to move. And since we have kings on same color square along the file, an odd number of squares in between the kings, and it's black's turn to move, we could say that white has the opposition. White has taken the opposition. And all that means is that white will get their desired result, which, since white has the pawn, white will win. If white plays this correctly, there's nothing that black can do to save the game. And I like to think of it as white is fighting for control of these three squares, directly in between the kings. So e4, d4, and c4. And by playing king d3 and forcing black to make a move, black must cede control of at least one of these squares. Since black only has their king left, they have to make a king move, and there's nowhere black can go that will keep control over all three of these squares. So let's say that black plays king c5. A reasonable move, he just sidesteps. So black is still controlling d4 and c4, but now black does not have control over e4, which is the square that white's king now wants to go to, king e4. And this is a maneuver called outflanking. You can notice the parallel to actual war. Chess is a war game, and here white is outflanking their opponent. They're moving up the board and taking the square that was just ceded by the black king moving to c5. And white will repeat this process as much as possible until it's safe to bring the pawn up, or until black is like almost literally pushed off the board with their king. And you don't want to push the pawn prematurely. Remember, keep this pawn back. You're trying to clear as much space in front of the pawn before you bring it up. So let's say black plays king d6. I mean, naturally, black might want to get in the way of the pawn's advance. He probably figures that this is the best way to try to hold the position. Now, again, pawn d4 would be a massive mistake by white. If white were to play pawn d4, black would play king to e6. And guess what? Black has taken the opposition in this case. We can run through their criteria. The kings are on the same color square, light squares, along the e-file. There's an odd number of squares in between, just one, and it's white to move. You don't want the move if opposition is concerned. You want it to be your opponent's move, so they have to give up space, give up key squares. But if white is familiar with the concept of the opposition, after king d6, they'll have no trouble finding the best move, which is king d4. So king d4, now we've got three squares right here, e5, d5, and c5 up for grabs. Let's say black plays, in this case, king to e6. What should white do? If you want to pause your video and figure that out, you can do so now. Okay, so black is keeping control over e5 and d5, but they've given up control of c5. And that's a square that white wants to take with their king. King c5. Now, this process can repeat if black plays king d7. White will go king d5. It's more of the same. At some point, black usually deviates, or the side down the pawn usually deviates. If they play king e7, white could actually bring up the pawn if they want, but it's also possible to play king c6 and continue taking space upwards, up the board. But let's just say for the sake of argument, black does play this king d7 move. White plays king d5, taking the opposition again. King c7, you know the drill now. We're outflanking king e6. And let's say king c6. So now the kings are on opposite sides of the pawn. Here white has done his job with his king. He's cleared space in front, and it is time to move the pawn. And because the pawn hasn't moved from d2 yet, we can push it 2 squares. So pawn d4. Black can't go to d5 or c5, so let's say king to c7. Now white can push d5. And here, let's say king to d8. Now, white to move. If you'd like to pause your video and figure out what white should do, you can do so now. All right, so this position encapsulates the opposition, basically. Many players who haven't studied this would simply push pawn d6. And probably some of you watching have done this before. I know I have when I didn't know about the opposition. It looks correct, you push the pawn, but black can play king e8 if you do that. And black has taken the opposition. White cannot win now, because if they push the pawn check, king goes back here, and white faces this dilemma that they had earlier. Either give stalemate with king d6, or move the king somewhere else and give up the pawn. Not good. So instead, the correct move is the opposition move. King to d6. King's on same color square, odd number of squares in between, black to move. That's perfect. If black could pass right now, he would love to do so, but the rules of chess don't allow for that. So black must make a move. King e8 or king to c8. And either way, White will go to the other side, and after a move like king e7, d6 check, king e8, d7 check, king e7, and white gets to promote the pawn, get a queen, and win. So if white is knowledgeable about the opposition from that initial position, then there's nothing black can do to save the game. Provided that white plays king d3, no amount of scratching and clawing will get black in this game. White has the opposition. Now, I think one of the best ways to learn endgames is to learn a key concept like the opposition and then change the type of position up. So don't just stick to like what I'm showing you here. Set up your own example of a king and pawn versus king position and try to play it out. So I'll give you some examples right now. Let's say we're black to move here. What would be the result if we were black to move instead of white to move? Well, our knowledge of the opposition should give us the move pretty quick. King e4. And now we've stopped white from coming up with their king. Let's say white plays d3 check. Black can play king to d4. King d2. Now, don't panic if you're the defending side in this position. Even though you have to retreat your king, it's not a big deal. Because as we've already demonstrated, the fact that the pawn is coming forward doesn't necessarily mean that the side with the extra pawn will win. So if you have to retreat with your king, you should always go directly backwards. King e5 or king c5 does not spoil anything for now, but as a rule of thumb, going directly backwards is always your safest bet. The reason is you want to be prepared to go to either e5 or c5, depending upon which way white goes with their king. So say white plays king e3, we'll play king e5. Opposition. Let's say d4 check, king right back in front of the pawn, king d3. Technically white has opposition here, but there is a pawn in the way, and if we play king d6, white cannot maintain that opposition. They're going to go to either e4 or c4, and we've got a corresponding square. A good rule of thumb is that the defending side prefers symmetry with the kings. They like the kings on the same file because that stops the white king, or the stronger side's king, from coming up. The side that's trying to win prefers that asymmetry. Remember that outflanking idea? The side that's trying to win wants the king to be able to pass the other king and work its way up the board. But if you're just defending, you like that symmetry with the kings, and you like the fact that the stronger king can't get in front of the pawn, because that's the scenario that really kills you. And if black plays this correctly, it will just be a draw, as we've already shown. This is just a dead draw. We're eventually going to get a stalemate, or white will give up the pawn and we'll draw that way. So a couple more situations involving opposition. Let's say we just change one thing about this position. So instead of the black king being on d5, let's put the king on d6. Now here's a nice challenge for you guys. Let's evaluate this position for both white and black to move. So that is, if it were white to move here, what should white do and what is the correct result of the game? And same question for black. If it's black to move, what should black do and what is the correct result of the game? And if you want to pause your video and figure that out now, you can do so. Okay, so let's start with white because I think that's easier. So if it were white to move, the most obvious attempt would be to bring the king in front of the pawn. So either king e3 or king d3, because we know that the king belongs in front of the pawn, clearing territory. But you quickly realize the problem if you do that. Let's say king d3. If we play king d3, black will play king d5. And we've got our three criteria. Black has taken the opposition, white's going to go one way with their king, and black is going to follow. Black likes that symmetry. Black does not want to outflank. Do not play king c4 if you're black here. That's a quick way to go wrong. White would play king e4 and you're losing. So you just play defense, you stay in front of the king along the file. Now if white goes like too far away from the pawn, like king f3, you can cut back towards the pawn, stay right in front, that's fine. But summing up this position for white to move, white cannot win because king d3 would be met by king d5 with opposition. Likewise, king e3 will be met by king e5. The same dilemma, opposition. White's going to either move their king around and never get anywhere, or eventually push the pawn, which will also be drawn. White could try some tricky business like king d1 or something, but king d5, no problem for black. It's still a draw. Now, with black to move, it's more difficult. This is one of the cool things about Just simple king and pawn versus king positions. It's not always what meets the eye. So with black to move, they have to find a precise move. They have to find an only move because the logical attempts will fail. I think most players, if they were playing this in a fast game and weren't knowledgeable about the opposition, they would just move the king up. They'd play king d5, maybe king e5. They'd figure, well, let's go after this pawn. Let's try to put our king in the way and make it hard for white to win. But we know that's a losing idea. If king d5, white gets to play king d3. And this is a perfect example of mutual zugzwang. Mutual zugzwang. The side that's on move is not happy here. So if white's able to play king d3, black has to cede territory with their king. They're fighting for control of those 3 squares. If black goes here, we know the drill by now. King c4, outflanking. Black loses. Likewise, if king e5, white's going to play king e3. And same conclusion. So this is a standoff scenario. Neither side wants to bring their king to either d3, e3, or d5, e5 first. It's a standoff. So the correct move for black is king e6, taking the opposition. Now, if you applied the opposition and found this move, give yourself a pat on the back. This is perfectly in line with our 3 criteria. Kings are on the same color square. Along the e file, there's an odd number of squares in between. This time it's 3 squares. Usually it's 1, but 3 is possible. With 1 square in between, it's called direct opposition. With 3 squares, it's distant opposition. But often, distant opposition will function the same way. Not always, but in this case it does. And it's the opponent's turn to move. So after king e6, it's white to move. White's not going to be able to win, because if white comes up, they're the first one to break this standoff. Not good. Black gains the opposition. So king e6 is a must move for black. If they don't find that move, they will lose. Anything else is failing. Note that going to the c file would allow king e3 in the case of king c5. Here we actually have a case of, you might call it diagonal opposition, but it kind of functions the same way. And as I've already established, the defending side king should not really get into an outflanking scenario. You want your kings lined up along the file for the most part. So king e6 is the drawing move. Now there are some exceptions. I'll give you guys kind of a taste of one of those exceptions right now. I do plan to make a separate video to address some of the exceptions to the opposition in king and pawn versus king scenarios. So let's say we put the black king way back on d8. Now, at first this just looks hopeless for black, no matter whose move it is, because the king is so far away from the pawn. It doesn't seem like there's anything stopping the white king from coming up. And in fact, this position is hopeless. White to move would win pretty easily. Let's say it's black to move. Now, with black to move, king e8 is not going to be a hard move to find for you at this point, because here we've taken the opposition. This time there's 5 squares in between. But you'll quickly see the problem once we start making a few king moves. So white's going to move their king up, trying to clear space. King d6. Now once we reach this position, what should white do? If you'd like to pause your video and figure that out, you could do so now. Okay, so it's important to realize that this position is very different from this position, which we saw earlier. And the difference is, white has an available pawn move here, and they can play pawn to d3. This is called a reserve tempo, and in playing d3, white basically throws the ball right back in black's court and says, here, you take the move. I don't want it. I want my king here, but I don't want the move anymore. And since opposition is so move dependent, black is not happy about this development. Now black has to move their king, and we know what will happen. King e6, king c5, outflanking. White will win. So I just wanted to plant the seed in your head that you can't strictly apply opposition 100% of the time. It's the dominant theme in king and pawn versus king positions, but there are exceptions like what you see here with the reserve tempo. Also, there's some exceptions called key squares. Also with edge pawns, like rook pawns in particular, there's some cases where the opposition does not apply. But for the most part, for now, if you've been able to digest and fully understand this concept of the opposition, you're doing A-OK when it comes down to king and pawn versus king. And you have the ability to evaluate the vast majority of king and pawn versus king positions. It's all about that opposition and those 3 criteria in the opposition. So I hope this gives you the knowledge that you need to play and evaluate this ending properly. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments to this video. And as I said, I'll be coming out with another video or two soon to reinforce this concept. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.